Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomaly Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you're listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I walked into the hospital at 8:40 p.m., earlier than necessary, parked my car in the farthest spot from the entrance, grabbed my gear, and made my way inside. The automatic doors slid open without a sound. The woman behind the front desk glanced up briefly as I walked in. She asked my name, typed something into her computer, handed me a clipboard to sign, and gestured toward the waiting area. I sat down, looked at the clock on the wall, and started scrolling through my phone, waiting for whoever was supposed to meet me. The man arrived at exactly 9:30 p.m., tall, broad, and sharp-featured. He walked straight toward me, introduced himself as Mr. Grant, didn't wait for me to respond, and motioned for me to follow him. We walked through a short corridor that led to the security room. He unlocked the door with a code I couldn't see from where I stood, pushed it open, and walked inside. I followed him and glanced at the setup. A desk covered in monitors, each displaying black and white feeds of different parts of the hospital, along with a stack of folders and a small pile of equipment. Grant turned, handed me a folded piece of paper, and told me to read it. I unfolded the paper, read through the 7 rules, and asked what I was supposed to make of it. He ignored the question and told me to stick to them, no matter how strange they seemed. He walked me through the building, explained the camera system, and pointed out the areas I'd need to patrol: the ICU, the cafeteria, the general ward, and the main entrance. After the walkthrough, he handed me the keys to the security room, left without another word, and didn't bother to wait for me to ask any follow-up questions. At exactly 10 p.m., I sat down in the security room, locked the door, and checked the cameras. The ICU lights were on. The cafeteria was empty. The general ward showed nothing unusual. The main entrance was quiet. The clock hit 10:15, and I left the security room, locked it behind me, and started my patrol. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, walked down the hallway, opened every door, checked every room, and didn't find anyone. I took the stairs to the 2nd floor and repeated the process. The rooms were all empty, and nothing seemed out of place. I walked into the ICU on the 1st floor, glanced at the beds, checked the lights, and found nothing unusual. I kept moving, walked past the cafeteria, and saw the tables and chairs neatly arranged. I unlocked the door to the general ward, stepped inside, and saw a row of empty beds. I walked down the hallway, checking each room one by one, and locked the door behind me when I left. I got back to the security room at 10:50, sat down, checked the cameras again, and noticed nothing had changed. I unlocked the drawer on the desk, found a flashlight, and checked its batteries. The hallway monitors flickered briefly, but returned to normal before I could do anything about it. At exactly 11 p.m., I heard a knock at the main entrance, leaned forward, switched to the camera covering the door, and saw a woman standing outside. She looked straight at the camera and started knocking again. I glanced at the rules, reread the 2nd one, and didn't move from my chair. She knocked harder, shouted that she needed to see her husband, and looked directly at the lens as if she could see me through it. I sat still, stared at the monitor, and didn't move. Her knocking grew louder, and she started slamming her palms against the glass, screaming for someone to let her in. Her voice cracked, and she started sobbing, but I stayed where I was. She turned suddenly, stepped back, and stopped moving. Her head snapped toward the camera one last time, her eyes blank and unmoving. Then she disappeared from the monitor completely. I locked the security room, checked the cameras again, and didn't see anything unusual. I waited until the clock hit midnight, grabbed the flashlight, and headed back to the ICU to check the lights. They were still on, but I noticed faint smudges on the floor leading to one of the rooms. I followed them, saw they led to a bed with rumpled sheets, and looked closer. There was nothing there. I turned and walked back to the hallway, but stopped when I heard something faint behind me. I spun around, shined a flashlight into the room, and saw nothing but the empty bed. I kept walking, reached the cafeteria, and stepped inside. Everything was where it should be. I walked back to the security room, locked the door, and checked the cameras again. At 12:30 a.m., the ICU monitor flickered. The lights went off, and the screen froze. I left the room immediately, jogged down the hallway, reached the ICU, and found it in complete darkness. I stepped inside, walked to the light switch, and flipped it. The lights came on, and the room was empty, just as it had been earlier. I turned, walked back to the security room, and locked the door behind me. I kept watching the monitors, flipping between them every few seconds, waiting for something to happen. The camera covering the cafeteria flickered, and I saw a figure sitting at one of the tables. I switched to the hallway camera leading to the cafeteria and saw nothing. I grabbed the flashlight, unlocked the security room, and walked toward the cafeteria. I stepped inside, scanned the room, and saw the chair pulled out from one of the tables. I checked every corner, found nothing, and left. The clock hit 1 a.m., and I grabbed the flashlight again. I unlocked the door to the general ward, stepped inside, and walked down the hallway. The first few rooms were empty, just as they had been earlier. I opened another door and saw a man sitting on the bed, staring at the wall. He looked up when I stepped inside and asked for water. I told him to wait, walked to the cafeteria, grabbed a cup, and brought it back. He took it, drank it, thanked me, and didn't say anything else. I left the room, checked the rest of the ward, found nothing unusual, and walked back to the security room. By 1:30 a.m., I was back in the chair, watching the monitors, flipping between feeds. The ICU lights flickered but stayed on. The hallways were empty. The cafeteria camera showed the tables undisturbed. The main entrance was still quiet. I leaned back, checked the clock again, and waited for something to happen. I locked the security room door, checked the cameras, and noted that everything seemed still. The ICU lights were on. The general ward hallway was empty. The cafeteria remained untouched, and the main entrance showed nothing unusual. I set the flashlight on the desk, leaned forward, and cycled through the feeds one by one, keeping an eye on any flicker or sudden change. The clock on the wall read 2:05 a.m., and I hadn't moved from the chair since finishing the last patrol. The ICU monitor blinked suddenly, the feed cutting out for 3 seconds before returning. The lights in the hallway were off. I grabbed the flashlight, unlocked the door, stepped out into the hallway, and moved quickly toward the ICU. The silence around me wasn't something I noticed. I was too focused on counting the steps, staying aware of the beam from the flashlight bouncing in front of me, and making sure the light switch wasn't far ahead. I reached the ICU doors, pushed them open with my shoulder, and walked inside. The room stretched ahead, each empty bed in its exact place from earlier, but the lights were still off. I moved to the wall, flipped the switch, and watched the fluorescent bulbs flicker back to life, one row after another. The beds appeared the same, untouched, and the smudged floor I'd seen earlier now looked cleaned. I scanned the room again, checked for anything out of place, and stepped back toward the hallway. Just as I crossed the threshold, I heard a sharp click behind me and spun around. The lights were off again. I didn't wait this time. I crossed the room quickly, turned the lights back on, and held my position by the switch. I scanned the room again, moving the flashlight in a wide arc, checking each corner and every shadow behind the equipment. The beds remained empty. I kept the flashlight pointed at the farthest end of the room, flipped the switch one more time for reassurance, and walked out, letting the doors swing shut behind me. I walked past the cafeteria on my way back to the security room and glanced through the glass windows. noticing for the first time that a chair was now pulled away from one of the tables. I stepped closer to the door, tried to recall if I'd seen it like that earlier, and decided it didn't matter. I walked inside, checked the corners of the room with the flashlight, and found nothing unusual aside from the chair. I slid it back into place, turned around, and walked back to the door. As I stepped into the hallway, the ICU lights flickered again in my peripheral vision. I turned toward the security room instead, quickened my pace, unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. The cameras flickered briefly as I sat down, and I noticed movement in the ICU feed. A figure appeared at the farthest end of the hallway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a white coat. I leaned forward, stared at the screen, and waited to see if they moved closer, but the feed froze for 2 seconds, and the figure disappeared. I switched to the hallway feed and saw nothing. I toggled between all the cameras, scanning each corner of the building, and still saw no movement. The ICU feed returned to normal, the lights steady this time, and the beds as empty as they'd been all night. I reached for the flashlight again, stood, and unlocked the door. I stepped into the hallway, turned right toward the ICU, and walked the length of the corridor again. When I pushed the ICU doors open this time, I didn't go straight to the light switch. I walked to the farthest bed where I thought I'd seen the figure and checked around it. There were faint marks on the floor, scratches in the shape of wide arcs that seemed too deliberate to be from anything accidental. I crouched, pointed the flashlight down at the floor, and noticed that the scratches seemed to lead under the bed itself. I stood up quickly, scanned the room again, and stepped back toward the door. The light stayed on as I walked out this time, but just as I reached the hallway intersection leading back to the security room, I saw movement on the left feed covering the general ward. I turned toward the door, unlocked it with the key, and stepped inside. The camera showed one of the beds occupied now, a figure sitting upright with their back to the lens. I picked up the flashlight again, left the room, and headed straight for the general ward. The hallway door creaked as I opened it, and I immediately turned to the room where the figure had been sitting. The door to that specific room was slightly ajar, the only one not properly shut. I stepped inside, aimed the flashlight directly at the bed, and saw an elderly man wearing a patient gown, sitting upright and breathing heavily. He turned his head slowly when I stepped closer and asked, "Can you help me get water?" I didn't hesitate this time. I nodded, told him to wait, turned back toward the hallway, and walked to the cafeteria. The chair I'd pushed in earlier was pulled out again, but I didn't stop this time. I walked straight to the coffee station, grabbed a styrofoam cup, filled it from the water dispenser, and headed back to the general ward. The man was still sitting upright, his breathing even heavier now, as if each breath scraped through his throat. I handed him the cup, watched him drink it in one long pull, and waited as he set the empty cup down on the nightstand beside him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible now, before lying back down on the bed. I turned, left the room, and closed the door behind me. The hallway was empty again, the same as when I'd first walked in, and I checked each room as I passed them on the way out. They remained unoccupied, and the bed stayed undisturbed. I walked back to the security room, locked the door, and checked the cameras again. It was 3 a.m. now, and the ICU lights stayed steady on the feed, but the cafeteria camera showed the chair pulled out again. I leaned forward, stared at the screen, and thought I saw a shadow pass in front of the table before disappearing completely. I grabbed the flashlight again, stood up, and walked toward the cafeteria. I left the security room, walked down the hallway toward the cafeteria, and stopped at the door. The chair that had been pulled out was the same one I'd seen earlier, but now there was a figure sitting in it. A girl, maybe 8 years old, sat with her back to me, her head tilted slightly to the side, and a teddy bear clutched tightly in her lap. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and kept the flashlight pointed at the floor. I remembered Rule 4, took a deep breath, and walked to the chair next to hers. I sat down without a word, glanced at her briefly, and then stared straight ahead. She sat perfectly still for several seconds before she began humming a song, the sound soft but constant, her shoulders rocking slightly with the rhythm. I didn't move, kept my hands on my knees, and avoided turning my head. Her humming stopped abruptly, and she turned to face me. "Do you want to play a game?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. I didn't answer, remembered the rule, and stayed silent. She tilted her head further, leaned slightly closer, and repeated the question. "Do you want to play a game?" I shook my head, careful not to make any sudden movements. She turned back to the teddy bear in her lap, began brushing its buttoned eyes with her fingers, and started humming again. I sat still, waited for her to say something else, and kept my gaze fixed on the opposite wall. The humming grew louder, stopped again, and she leaned toward me. "You're not playing fair," she said, her voice sharper this time, and she turned to look directly at me. "You're supposed to answer when I ask." I froze, stayed silent, and didn't respond. She held the teddy bear out toward me, its missing button eye dangling by a thread, and said, "Hold him." I didn't reach for it, glanced at the rule in my head again, and realized it didn't mention anything about touching the bear. She set it on the table between us, stood up, and stepped away from the chair. "You're no fun," she said as she walked to the far corner of the cafeteria, still humming as she disappeared from sight. I waited until I couldn't hear her anymore, stood up, and walked back to the door without looking back. I stepped into the hallway, headed straight for the security room, and locked the door behind me. The camera feed for the cafeteria showed the chairs still pulled out, but there was no sign of the girl. The teddy bear was still on the table, its button eye catching the light from the ceiling, and I stared at the monitor for several minutes before switching to another feed. The ICU lights were on, the general ward hallway was empty, and the main entrance showed no movement. I leaned forward, flipped back to the cafeteria feed, and saw that the bear was now gone. I reached for the flashlight, stood up, and unlocked the door again. I stepped into the hallway, checked both directions, and walked back toward the cafeteria. The door was still open from earlier, and I stepped inside, checked the table where the bear had been, and saw nothing but a faint outline of dust where it had been sitting. I walked to the corner where the girl had disappeared, checked behind the counters, and found nothing. I walked back into the hallway, glanced toward the ICU, and decided to check the cameras again. As I approached the security room, I heard faint humming coming from the direction of the cafeteria. I stopped, turned back toward the door, and saw the girl standing by the window, holding the bear in her arms again. She didn't look in my direction, but started swaying from side to side, the humming growing slightly louder. I walked backward, kept my eyes on her, and stepped into the security room. I locked the door, sat down, and switched to the cafeteria camera. The chair was now pushed in, and the girl was no longer there. The ICU monitor flickered again, and the lights in the hallway went out. I grabbed the flashlight, unlocked the door, and jogged toward the ICU. I pushed the doors open, flipped the switch, and watched the lights come back on one by one. The scratches I'd seen earlier on the floor were now gone, as if someone had wiped them clean. I scanned the room with the flashlight, checked each corner, and walked back toward the hallway. The cafeteria door creaked faintly as it swung shut behind me, and I turned toward it but didn't go back. I walked toward the general ward instead, unlocked the door, and checked the hallway. The rooms were all closed, but the camera feed earlier had shown one door slightly ajar. I stepped inside, walked down the hallway, and reached the room with the open door. I pushed it open slowly, aimed the flashlight at the bed, and saw it was now empty. The patient who had been sitting there earlier was gone. The cup of water I brought him earlier was still on the nightstand, but it was now cracked in half, the water spilled onto the floor. I turned, walked back down the hallway, and checked each room as I passed. They were all empty, just as they'd been earlier. I stepped back into the main hallway, walked back to the security room, and locked the door behind me. The cafeteria camera now showed all the chairs pushed in, The ICU lights were still on, and the general ward hallway was empty again. The clock on the wall read 4:10 a.m., and I leaned back, flipped between the feeds, and waited for something to change. The cafeteria feed flickered briefly, and I switched back to it. The girl was now standing on one of the tables, holding the teddy bear over her head, her back to the camera. I grabbed the flashlight, stood up, and walked toward the door again. I stepped into the hallway, headed straight for the cafeteria, and opened the door. The chairs were all in place, the tables undisturbed, and the girl was gone again. The clock on the security monitor showed 1 a.m. I grabbed the flashlight, left the security room, locked the door behind me, and walked toward the general ward. The hallway leading to the ward was empty, the same as before, and I reached the ward door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. I scanned the hallway ahead of me and checked each door one by one as I walked down the corridor. The first few rooms were empty, the beds undisturbed, and the monitors silent. I reached the room where the patient had been earlier, opened the door, and saw the bed now empty, the sheets still slightly rumpled. I stepped inside, checked the corners, and walked back into the hallway. The next room had its door slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, sweeping the flashlight across the bed. A man sat upright, his hands resting on his knees, and his head turned toward me as soon as the light hit him. "Can you get me some water?" he said, his voice rasping and uneven. I nodded, turned, and walked back toward the cafeteria. I didn't stop to check the chairs or tables this time. Went straight to the water dispenser, filled a styrofoam cup, and walked back to the general ward. I stepped into the man's room, handed him the water, and watched as he drank it in one long gulp, his throat moving in uneven jerks with each swallow. He set the empty cup down on the nightstand beside him, leaned back against the wall, and didn't say anything else. I turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind me. I walked to the next room, opened the door, and saw an elderly woman lying on the bed. She turned her head toward me, her eyes wide and unfocused, and whispered, "It's cold. Can you bring me a blanket?" I nodded, walked back to the supply closet near the ward entrance, opened it, and grabbed a folded blanket from the top shelf. I returned to her room, unfolded the blanket, and laid it over her. She didn't say anything else, just turned her head away and closed her eyes. The hallway ahead of me seemed unchanged, the door still closed, and I walked to the last room at the end. The door was already open, and I stepped inside, pointing the flashlight toward the bed. A young man sat with his legs dangling over the side, his hospital gown loose around his thin frame. He turned to face me, smiled faintly, and said, "Stay for a moment." I nodded, stepped closer to the bed, and stood near the foot of it. He kept his eyes on me, his smile fading slightly, and added, "You shouldn't be here." I didn't respond, waited for him to say something else, and glanced toward the hallway behind me. When I looked back, the bed was empty, and the man was gone. I shined the flashlight around the room, checked behind the curtains, and stepped back into the hallway. I turned toward the ward in trance, checked the other rooms on my way out, and found them all empty again. I locked the ward door, walked back to the security room, and checked the cameras. The ICU feed was still active, the lights steady, and the beds undisturbed. The cafeteria camera showed the tables and chairs in place, and the main entrance showed no movement. The clock on the wall read 2:15 a.m., and I leaned forward, cycled through the feeds again, and kept my eyes on the general ward. The hallway camera flickered briefly, and I switched back to it, noticing that one of the ward doors was now open. I grabbed the flashlight, stood up, unlocked the door, and walked back to the ward. The door I'd seen open on the camera was the same one I checked earlier, and I stepped inside, aiming the flashlight toward the bed. The elderly woman who had asked for the blanket was now sitting up, the blanket pulled around her waist. She turned to me and whispered, "He's here." I didn't say anything, waited to see if she would add more, and kept the flashlight on her. She didn't move, just kept staring past me, her eyes fixed on the doorway. I stepped closer, turned to follow her gaze, and saw nothing in the hallway. I turned back to her, but the bed was now empty, and the blanket was neatly folded where she had been sitting. I walked to the hallway, closed the door, and checked the other rooms again. The patient who had asked for water was also gone, his bed made, and the empty cup still sitting on the nightstand. The last room at the end of the hallway was open again, and I stepped inside. The young man was sitting on the bed again, his legs crossed this time, and he looked up at me as I entered. "Didn't you hear her?" he asked. "He's here." I stepped back toward the door, kept the flashlight on him, and didn't respond. He tilted his head to one side, his expression blank, and added, "You should go back to your room." I didn't wait this time, turned toward the hallway, and walked straight to the ward entrance. I locked the door behind me, walked back to the security room, and sat down. The camera feed for the general ward flickered again, and I saw all the ward doors now open. The ICU monitor was steady, but the cafeteria camera showed the chairs and tables rearranged into a circle. I switched between the feeds, leaned closer to the monitors, and noticed that the hallway outside the ward showed a faint shadow moving across the far end. The clock on the monitor showed 4:45 a.m. I grabbed the flashlight, locked the security room door behind me, and walked down the hallway toward the cafeteria. The chairs and tables on the camera had been rearranged into a circle, and I pushed the cafeteria door open, stepping inside with the flashlight aimed at the floor. The tables were pushed tightly together, forming a perfect ring with all the chairs facing inward. The middle of the circle was empty. I checked the corners of the room, swept the flashlight under the tables, and didn't find anything unusual except the arrangement. I pushed the tables apart one by one, moved the chairs back into place, and left the cafeteria, letting the door swing shut behind me. I walked back toward the ICU, glanced through the glass in the hallway door, and saw the lights flicker once before steadying. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and walked down the hallway. Each bed looked the same as it had before, the sheets neat and undisturbed. I reached the far end of the hallway, checked behind the last curtain, and turned back toward the entrance. The lights flickered again, and I heard a faint sound coming from one of the rooms. I walked back down the hallway, checked each bed again, and didn't find anything. I walked out of the ICU, locked the door behind me, and turned back toward the security room. The camera monitors flickered briefly as I entered, and I noticed that one of the ICU beds was now occupied. A figure was sitting upright, its silhouette barely visible in the grainy feed. I switched to the hallway feed outside the ICU door and saw no one had entered. I grabbed the flashlight again, walked back to the ICU, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The bed closest to the camera and the feed was empty, and I walked to the far end of the hallway to check each room. All of them were still empty. I stepped back into the hallway, locked the door, and returned to the security room. The clock read 5:10 a.m., and I leaned forward, cycling through the cameras. The cafeteria was empty now, all the chairs and tables in their proper places. The general ward feed flickered briefly, and one of the doors was open again. I grabbed the flashlight, walked back to the ward, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The door to the room at the end of the hallway was open, the same one I had checked earlier, and I walked toward it, the flashlight aimed ahead. I stepped inside, swept the light across the room, and saw the young man sitting on the bed again. "You're not done," he said, his voice calm but steady. "He's still waiting." I didn't respond, stepped back into the hallway, and closed the door behind me. I walked to the ward entrance, locked it, and returned to the security room. The ICU feed flickered again, and I saw the same figure now lying down in one of the beds, its head turned toward the camera. The cafeteria camera showed one of the chairs pushed back from the table, and the general ward feed remained steady with all the doors closed again. The clock showed 5:30 a.m. The ICU monitor flickered, and the lights went out completely. I grabbed the flashlight, left the security room, and walked quickly to the ICU. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and flipped the switch. The lights flickered back on, one by one, and I walked down the hallway, checking each bed again. The bed that had been occupied on the camera was empty, and the sheets were neatly tucked. I checked behind the curtains, opened each cabinet, and didn't find anything. I turned back toward the hallway entrance, glanced at the light switch, and walked out. I returned to the security room, checked the cameras, and saw movement on the cafeteria feed. The girl with the teddy bear was standing in the center of the room now, her back to the camera, and she began swaying from side to side. I leaned closer to the monitor, switched to the hallway feed outside the cafeteria, and saw nothing there. I stood up, walked to the hallway, and opened the cafeteria door. She wasn't there, and the teddy bear was lying on the table closest to the door. I stepped inside, picked up the bear, and set it back on the table where I had first seen it earlier. I walked back to the hallway, shut the door, and returned to the security room. The ICU camera showed the lights flicker again, and one of the beds was occupied again. I toggled between the feeds, checked the cafeteria, the general ward, and the main entrance, and saw nothing unusual except the ICU bed. The clock read 5:50 a.m., and I leaned back, waited for the clock to tick closer to the shift's end, and kept cycling through the cameras. The ICU feed cut out completely for several seconds, and when it returned, the figure in the bed was gone. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and walked back to the ICU. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and walked down the hallway again, checking each bed. The sheets were all undisturbed, the curtains drawn back, and the monitors silent. I turned back toward the entrance, checked the last bed again, and walked out. I locked the door, returned to the security room, and checked the cameras again. At 6 a.m., the monitors showed movement in the main entrance. The day staff began arriving, walking through the doors, and gathering near the reception desk. The cameras all seemed normal now, no flickers or sudden changes, and I locked the security room door, left the building, and walked to my car. I didn't look back as I drove away. I got home late, somewhere around 11 p.m., maybe closer to midnight. My key jammed in the lock like it always did, and I shoved the door open with my shoulder. Inside, the place was exactly how I'd left it. TV off, laptop on the couch, empty beer bottles on the coffee table, nothing out of place. I tossed my bag onto the couch, pulled out a joint from the stash in the side pocket, and lit up while grabbing my laptop. I sank into the cushions, started scrolling through YouTube, random videos playing one after the other. I wasn't paying much attention until the door creaked open behind me. I turned just enough to see Jordan walk in. He hung his jacket in the closet, walked past me without saying anything, and headed to his room. Same routine as always, nothing strange about it. I didn't bother acknowledging him. I kept watching videos, finishing the joint, sinking deeper into the couch. A luxury cruise tour video switched to some bare-knuckle boxing highlights, and my eyelids started drooping. I caught the sound of water running, faint at first, then steady. Jordan must have turned on his shower. The sound blended into the background noise, and I drifted off. When I woke up, the room was dark, my laptop's screen blank. I rubbed my face, glanced at my phone. 3:30 a.m. My throat was dry, so I got up to grab water from the kitchen. The apartment was quiet except for the shower. I stopped mid-step. The water was still running, steady and unchanging, same as hours ago. I stared down the hallway at Jordan's closed bathroom door, wondering if he'd left it on by accident. I walked over, knocked once, twice. "Hey man, you good in there?" No response. I knocked harder, louder. Still nothing. My gut told me to push the door open, but it was locked. "Jordan, if you're messing with me, it's not funny," I said, louder this time, but the sound of the water didn't change. I grabbed my phone, figuring I'd call him. I opened it and saw a text from him sitting unread, sent at 1:20 a.m. Hey man, I couldn't sleep, so I went to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back. I stared at the message for a solid minute. Jordan didn't have a girlfriend, hadn't had one in the 3 months I'd known him. Even if he did, he'd never bothered to text me about going anywhere before. I looked at the bathroom door, then back at my phone. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. I stepped away from the door and walked to his desk. His laptop was still there, the screen off, and next to it sat his wallet and keys. If he'd left, why would he leave his phone, keys, and wallet behind? I sent him a text. Are you messing with me? Why is the shower on? No reply. I called him, straight to voicemail. I walked back to the couch, opened every app on my phone, looking for some distraction while my mind raced. But the sound of the shower wouldn't leave me alone. It wasn't just running water anymore. It was the fact that it never stopped, never changed. I tried turning up the volume on my phone, playing a random video, but even that wasn't enough to drown it out. I got up again, pacing the living room, staring at the bathroom door. I was debating whether to call 911 when I heard something buzz on the counter. I turned, walked to the kitchen, and there it was, Jordan's phone, vibrating with a notification. It stopped buzzing as I picked it up, but the screen stayed lit, showing missed calls, mine, the most recent one among them. I held the phone for a second before setting it back down. I looked back toward the bathroom door. The shower was still running. I couldn't think straight anymore, couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed my phone in my pocket, and walked out the door. I needed to clear my head, so I crossed the street and stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the building. Everything looked normal, quiet, just like it should be. My eyes moved to my balcony, and then I froze. Someone was standing there. A tall figure, too tall, its head close to the edge of the balcony above. It wasn't moving, just standing straight as a rail. I didn't move. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I stared up at the figure, and for a split second, I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow, but no. It was solid, and it was there. I forced myself to turn away, walk toward the McDonald's down the block, my legs stiff and unsteady. Inside, I went straight to the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and leaned against the sink. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I spoke. Someone's in my apartment, I said. I think it's a break-in. I'm not there, but they're still inside. The operator asked questions I could barely answer. I told him the address, said I'd be waiting outside the building. I left the bathroom and sat at a table by the window, staring out at the street. It was empty, the lights from the McDonald's flickering faintly on the wet pavement. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually I saw the flashing red and blue lights. I stepped outside, waved the officers down, and pointed to the apartment. It's still running, I said. The shower, it's been going for hours. And there's someone on the balcony. 2 officers went inside while I waited with another one by the squad car. I kept glancing back at the building, my eyes darting to the balcony, but it was empty now. The officer next to me asked me questions, what I'd seen, what I thought was happening, but I could barely respond. I just kept staring at the front door, waiting for the other 2 officers to come back out. Then I heard it, a single gunshot from inside the building. The officer next to me stiffened, his hand moving to his holster. I stared at the front door, but it didn't open. The minutes dragged on, and there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just silence. More squad cars pulled up, officers spilling out and rushing into the building. I stood there, motionless, my eyes fixed on the door. Whatever was happening inside, I didn't want to know. I didn't want to go back in. When the first officers emerged, their faces were pale, their eyes avoiding mine. No one said a word to me, not about the gunshot, not about what they'd found. I asked one of them what was going on, but all he said was, "Stay here." Then he walked away. I stood outside the building, waiting for something to happen, watching as more officers arrived, each one rushing inside without a word to me. The first group still hadn't come back, and no one was saying what the hell was going on in there. I kept my eyes on the front door, not sure if I should stay or run, not sure if anything I'd said had made sense to them, or if they thought I was crazy. I pulled out my phone again, stared at Jordan's last message, then swiped to my recent calls. I tried dialing him again, listening to it ring once, twice, straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I shoved the phone back in my pocket, pacing back and forth near the squad cars, glancing up at the balcony every few seconds. There was nothing there now, no sign of the figure I'd seen earlier, but that didn't mean anything. The idea of going back up there made my chest tighten, but the waiting wasn't any better. I couldn't stop thinking about the gunshot. When the door finally opened, 2 officers came out, their faces tight, eyes darting everywhere but at me. One of them spoke briefly to the group outside, pointing toward the upper floors, and then they both got into their squad car and drove off. I walked up to one of the officers still standing by the door, asked him what they'd found, but he just shook his head and told me to stay put. I opened my mouth to press him, but the look he gave me shut me up. He wasn't scared of me. He was scared of something else. I stayed by the curb, trying not to look like I was listening, but I caught snippets of their radio chatter, words I didn't fully understand. Something about containment, something about backup. A few of the officers had guns drawn now, even though the building was still quiet. One of them glanced over at me, then quickly turned away. Whatever they'd found, they weren't going to tell me. I checked my phone again, looked at the time for 12 a.m., and then glanced back up at the apartment. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I just kept staring at the dark windows, my eyes flicking from one to the next, as if I might catch something moving behind the glass. My gaze drifted to the balcony again, and for a second, I thought I saw something shift, but it was gone before I could focus on it. A few minutes later, a black SUV pulled up. 2 people got out, not cops but plain clothes, both of them moving quickly toward the group of officers without so much as a glance in my direction. They disappeared inside, and I was left standing there again, staring at the door, waiting for answers that never came. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked away, crossing the street again, heading back toward the McDonald's. Inside, the lights felt harsh, and the place was almost empty now, just a couple of workers cleaning up, one of them mopping the floor near the counter. I went straight to the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and leaned against it, pulling out my phone again. I wasn't sure who I was supposed to call now. The police were already there, and Jordan wasn't answering. I thought about calling my boss, my parents, anyone, but I couldn't figure out how to explain any of this to them without sounding insane. I stared at the phone screen until it went dark, then shoved it back in my pocket and turned to the sink. I splashed water on my face, gripping the edges of the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my hair a mess, my shirt wrinkled and damp from leaning against the counter. I looked like shit, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was the way the light above the mirror kept flickering, casting weird shadows on the walls behind me. I straightened up, turned around, and unlocked the door, stepping back out into the main room. The worker with the mop glanced at me, but didn't say anything. I walked back to the table I'd been sitting at, pulled out my phone again, and stared at it until the screen blurred. I wasn't going back to the apartment, not after what I'd seen, but I couldn't just sit here all night either. I don't know how long I sat there before my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, my heart skipping, but it wasn't Jordan. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick it up. "Hello," I said, my voice cracking a little. There was a pause, then a voice I didn't recognize. "Is this Alex?" "Yeah." "Who's this?" "This is Officer Ramirez. You were at the apartment earlier, right?" "Yeah." "What's going on?" "Did you find Jordan?" Another pause, longer this time. "We need you to come back." "What? Why?" "I told you everything already." "I'm not. "Just come back," he said, cutting me off. "We need you here." The line went dead before I could say anything else. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking, then stood up, grabbing my jacket off the back of the chair. I walked out of the McDonald's, heading back toward the apartment, trying to tell myself this was normal, that they'd found something and needed me to explain it. But I didn't believe it. When I got back, the street was quieter than before. Most of the squad cars were gone now, and the black SUV was parked crooked near the curb. The front door was open again, the police tape fluttering in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The lobby was empty, the desk abandoned, the elevator doors open and dark inside. I headed for the stairs, climbing them slowly, one hand on the railing, my eyes fixed on the floor ahead. When I reached my floor, I stopped, listening, but the hallway was silent. I walked toward my apartment, the door still hanging slightly open, the faint sound of water echoing from inside. I pushed the door open wider, stepped inside, and looked around. The living room was exactly how I'd left it, the beer bottle still on the table, the laptop still on the couch. The bathroom door was shut, but I could hear the shower running behind it. I walked over, knocked once, twice, then reached for the doorknob. It wasn't locked anymore. I opened the door slowly, peering inside. The shower curtain was drawn, steam billowing out from behind it. Water was pooling on the floor, spreading out into the hallway. I stepped inside, reached for the curtain, and yanked it back. The tub was empty. The water kept running, splashing against the porcelain, but there was nothing there. I reached for the knobs, twisted them as hard as I could, but the water wouldn't stop. I turned around, my eyes scanning the room, then froze. The mirror was fogged up, but there was something on it, smeared in the condensation. I stepped closer, staring at it, trying to make sense of the shapes, but they didn't form words, just patterns, lines and swirls that didn't mean anything to me. I stepped back, my foot slipping in the water, and caught myself on the sink. I turned and walked out of the bathroom, not bothering to close the door behind me. I grabbed my phone from the couch, opened it, and stared at the screen, waiting for something, anything, but no new messages came. I sat down on the couch, the sound of the shower still echoing in my ears. I sat on the couch staring at my phone, the screen dimming and brightening as I tapped it every few seconds to keep it awake. The sound of the shower kept going in the background, steady and unchanging. I scrolled through my messages again, rereading Jordan's last text, then switched to my call log. I called him again, let it ring until it went to voicemail, and hung up without leaving a message. I stood up, walked to his desk, and picked up his phone. I tried unlocking it, but it was passcode protected. I set it back down and opened his laptop instead. The screen lit up, asking for a password, and I closed it again. I turned around, pacing the living room, glancing at the bathroom door every few seconds, the sound of the water drilling into my head. I stopped in front of his room. The door was closed, but I didn't remember hearing it shut after he came in earlier. I put my hand on the knob and turned it slowly, pushing the door open. The room was dark except for the faint glow of his computer monitor. The bed was unmade, his clothes still scattered on the floor, the closet door slightly ajar. I stepped inside, walked to the desk, and stared at the monitor. It was open to some kind of program I didn't recognize, lines of text scrolling by on a black background. I leaned closer, trying to read it, but the words didn't make sense. Random letters and numbers mixed together, no pattern I could understand. I turned away from the desk and opened his closet. Inside, there were a few shirts on hangers, a pair of shoes on the floor, and a cardboard box shoved into the corner. I pulled the box out, set it on the bed, and opened it. Inside were notebooks, stacks of papers, and a few folders. I grabbed one of the notebooks and flipped through it. The pages were filled with more of the same writing I'd seen on his monitor, symbols and numbers and letters that didn't mean anything to me. I opened one of the folders, pulled out a sheet of paper, and held it up to the light. It was a photocopy of some kind of map or diagram, circles and lines overlapping in intricate patterns, with handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. I put the folder back, shoved the box into the closet, and stepped out of his room, shutting the door behind me. I walked back to the couch, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 again. The operator answered, but before I could say anything, there was a loud knock at the door. I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear, then hung up and walked to the door. I opened it, and two men in suits stood there, one of them holding a badge. The taller one spoke first. "Alex, we're with the department. We need to ask you some questions." I nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. They walked past me into the living room, glancing around the apartment. The shorter one pointed toward the bathroom. "Is the shower still running?" I nodded again, and he walked over to the door, opened it slightly, and peeked inside. He stepped back, closed the door, and motioned for me to sit down. I sat on the couch while the two men stood in front of me, their expressions blank. The taller one pulled out a notepad and pen. "How long have you been living here?" he asked. 3 months, I said. He nodded, scribbling something down. "And your roommate, Jordan? How long have you known him?" "Same amount of time. We moved in around the same time." He nodded again. "Have you noticed anything unusual about him recently? Any changes in behavior?" I thought about the chanting I'd heard through the walls, the random late-night noises, the strange writing on his computer, but I wasn't sure how to explain it. "He keeps to himself," I said. "Sometimes he's up late working on stuff. I don't know what. He doesn't really talk about it." The shorter man leaned in slightly. "Have you ever seen him with anyone else? Visitors? Friends?" I shook my head. "No, he doesn't have people over. At least not when I'm around." The taller one nodded, writing again. "What about you? Have you experienced anything unusual since moving in? Any strange occurrences?" I hesitated, then told them about the figure on the balcony, the running shower, the text messages that didn't make sense. The shorter man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Have you heard voices in the apartment at night?" he asked. "Voices that didn't belong to you or Jordan?" I froze, my mouth half open. I thought about the nights I'd woken up to faint murmuring through the walls, sounds that I'd assumed were just Jordan talking to himself or watching something on his laptop. "Maybe," I said finally. "I don't know. I can't be sure." The taller man scribbled something down, then flipped his notebook shut. "We're going to take a look around," he said. "Wait here." They both walked past me, heading toward Jordan's room. I stayed on the couch, my hands gripping my knees, listening to their footsteps as they moved through the apartment. A few minutes later, they came back, their expressions still blank. "We'll be in touch," the taller one said, and they walked out without another word. I sat there for a few seconds, then stood up and walked to the door, locking it behind them. The apartment was silent now, except for the shower. I walked to the bathroom door, opened it, and turned the knobs again, but the water wouldn't stop. I closed the door, grabbed my phone, and sat back down on the couch, staring at the screen. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know what they'd found in Jordan's room, or if they'd found anything at all. I just sat there listening to the sound of the water, waiting for something to change. I sat on the couch, the sound of the shower continuing behind the bathroom door. I didn't check the time, didn't bother to move. I just stared at the wall, replaying everything over and over. The text message, Jordan's belongings, the figure on the balcony, the suits, the questions. I unlocked my phone, scrolled through my contacts, stared at Jordan's name for a moment, then shut it off and tossed it onto the coffee table. The knock at the door was sharp and sudden. I turned my head toward it, stood up, walked over, and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I unlocked the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway. It was empty, the other apartment doors closed, the lights flickering faintly overhead. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and locked it again, walking back to the couch. The bathroom door creaked open. I stood frozen, staring down the hallway, the faint glow of light spilling out from inside. The shower was still running. I stepped forward, my legs stiff, my shoes splashing slightly against the wet carpet. The bathroom light flickered as I reached the door. I pushed it open all the way. The shower curtain was pulled back now, the tub still overflowing with water that poured onto the floor and out into the hallway. I reached for the knobs again, twisting them as hard as I could, but the water didn't stop. I stepped back, my shoes sinking slightly into the wet floor, and turned to leave. The mirror caught my attention. The fog that had covered it earlier was gone now, wiped clean except for a single mark. I walked closer, leaning in, my breath catching as I made out the shape. A handprint, long and narrow, the fingers stretching impossibly far. I stepped back, turned away, and walked out of the bathroom, pulling the door shut behind me. The living room lights flickered once, then shut off completely. I stood there in the dark, my eyes adjusting slowly as I turned toward the couch. A faint glow came from my phone on the table, its screen lighting up with a notification. I walked over, picked it up, and stared at the message. It was from Jordan's number. "Come back. It's waiting." The timestamp showed it had been sent hours ago, before the suits arrived, before the police even came. My grip tightened on the phone as the screen flickered, then went black. The shadow moved across the wall. I turned slowly, my eyes locked on it as it stretched from the hallway toward the living room. It didn't have a clear shape, just long, jagged edges that crept along the surface like ink spreading through water. I stepped back, bumping into the coffee table, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The shadow paused for a moment, then started moving again, curling along the edges of the room, wrapping itself around the walls. I grabbed my jacket, ran to the door, unlocked it, and yanked it open. The hallway was dark now, the overhead lights flickering faintly as I stepped outside. I slammed the door shut behind me and started running, my footsteps echoing against the walls. I reached the stairwell, grabbed the railing, and took the stairs two at a time, not stopping until I hit the ground floor. The lobby was empty, the front door wide open, the police tape torn and hanging loosely from the frame. I ran outside, my breath coming in short bursts, my eyes scanning the street. It was empty, the McDonald's across the street dark now, its doors shut solid. I turned, looked up at my apartment balcony and froze. The figure was there again, tall and swaying, its head tilted slightly to the side. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there watching. I stepped back, turned, and ran down the street. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get as far away as possible. My footsteps echoed against the buildings as I moved, the streetlights flickering above me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following, but the street was empty. The sound of water followed me. I stopped, turned, and stared down the street. There was nothing there, no running faucets, no overflowing drains, but the sound was there, steady and unrelenting. I turned back, started running again, my legs burning as I pushed forward. I reached the end of the block, turned the corner, and froze. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the street, its long limbs stretching out to either side. I stepped back, my shoes scraping against the pavement, and turned around, sprinting back the way I'd come. The apartment building loomed ahead of me now, the front door still open, the shadow stretching out across the lobby floor. I ran inside, up the stairs, my hands gripping the railing as I climbed. I reached my floor, the hallway dark and empty, and ran to my apartment. I shoved the door open, stepped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. The shadow was waiting. It stretched across the walls, curling around the edges of the room, creeping toward me. I stepped back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. The phone buzzed next to me, the screen lighting up with another message from Jordan's number. Let it in. I grabbed the phone, stared at the screen, and then threw it across the room. The shadow moved faster now, the jagged edges curling toward me, wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. I tried to stand, tried to push myself up, but the floor seemed to shift beneath me, sinking and stretching as the shadow swallowed it whole. I grabbed at the table, at the couch, at anything I could reach, but the darkness pulled me deeper. The last thing I saw was the bathroom door swinging open, the water pouring out, filling the room as the shadow consumed everything around me. The alarm sounded as I flipped open my textbook to chapter 8, and I barely registered it before the metal slats dropped, one after another, sealing the windows and the door. The echo of grinding steel filled the room, and the red strobe above the door bathed everything in a nauseating light. Ivy's announcement came immediately, flat and calm. Level 3 contagion detected in the south quadrant of campus. Lockdown protocol is now in effect. Isolation protocol is now in effect. Mr. Whalen stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open as his eyes darted toward the camera mounted in the corner. Chairs scraped against the floor as students stood or shifted uneasily, the hum of whispered questions rising. But Mr. Whalen clapped his hands sharply, the sound silencing us. All right, everyone, stay calm. We've practiced these drills before. His voice cracked just slightly at the end. We just need to sit tight and follow protocol. The words weren't convincing anyone. Tyrell pushed up from his desk, crossed the room in 2 strides, and yanked on the door handle. It didn't budge. He slammed his shoulder into the door, then rattled it again with both hands before kicking it. This is bullshit. Ivy's voice cut through his words. Unauthorized tampering will result in disciplinary measures. Tyrell jumped back as the panel next to the door buzzed and flashed. His hands stayed clenched at his sides as he turned and glared at the ceiling-mounted camera. Mr. Whalen stepped forward quickly, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. That's enough. Everyone stay where you are. His face was pale, his tone sharp now, and I noticed his eyes flick toward the same camera Tyrell had glared at. No one touches the door again. Naomi raised her hand halfway, and then dropped it, speaking without waiting to be called on. What does level 3 mean? I've never heard that before. Mr. Whalen opened his mouth, but didn't speak immediately. It's serious. It's a higher alert level than we've had before, but this is probably a precaution. Ivy, he cleared his throat. Ivy, can you give us a status update? The response was immediate. Lockdown protocol is now in effect. Please remain in your designated safe area. Ivy's voice was unchanging, indifferent, and infuriatingly unhelpful. I heard someone mutter from the back of the room. I couldn't tell who it was, but the word trapped made its way through the murmurs that followed. Mr. Whalen clapped again, his tone sharper now. Everyone sit down. We're going to stay calm and wait for further instructions. The day passed slowly. Some of the students whispered nervously, while others stayed silent, their eyes darting to the red light that pulsed above the door every few seconds. Mr. Whalen stood near the front of the room, one hand gripping the edge of his desk while the other occasionally ran through his hair. He was staring at the camera again. I could tell he was hoping for a different answer. The first night was worse. No one slept. A few of the students lay their heads down on their desks, but their shifting and sighing made it clear they were awake. Ivy's announcement replayed every hour, reminding us that the lockdown remained in effect. I sat with my arms crossed, my foot tapping under the desk as I watched Mr. Whalen pace from one side of the room to the other. By the second day, Mr. Whalen announced that he had found snacks in the cabinet behind his desk. Candy bars, crackers, and canned cheese were distributed in silence, rationed to last as long as possible. I took my share and sat back down, eating, but the taste was meaningless. Jordan, sitting across from me, gave a weak smile and murmured something about this being temporary, but no one responded. The bathroom situation was addressed later that day. Desks were moved to shield a corner of the room, and buckets were placed behind them. Mr. Whalen didn't look at anyone as he gave the instructions, his voice clipped and curt, as if the whole arrangement had nothing to do with him. I caught Naomi's glance from across the room, but she didn't say anything either. Day 3 brought questions. Tyrell wasn't one to sit quietly, and his frustration boiled over when Ivy repeated her useless message for the 50th time. He demanded answers from Mr. Whalen, standing toe-to-toe with the teacher, his voice rising with every word. Mr. Whalen held his ground, but I saw his hand clench and unclench at his side, and his face was tight with an anger he couldn't let out. Tyrell finally stormed back to his desk, muttering curses under his breath. Lucas, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, flinched every time Tyrell's voice got loud. He was the smallest in the class, and I could tell the pressure was getting to him. He dropped his pencil at one point and bent down to pick it up, only to have Tyrell's foot kick it further away. He didn't say anything, just grabbed the pencil and returned to his desk, his shoulders hunched. Mr. Whalen didn't intervene. By day 4, the first real signs of decay began to show. Cassie collapsed during the morning, her head hitting her desk with a loud thud before sliding to the floor. Everyone jumped, but no one moved to help her until Mr. Whalen barked at Jordan and me to lift her up. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, and she was sweating through her shirt. Mr. Whalen told us to lay her on the floor near the wall and propped her head up with his jacket. He muttered something about dehydration, but when he glanced up at the camera, his jaw tightened. We rationed the remaining food even further that day, and no one said much after that. By the 5th day, the food was gone. Mr. Whalen had nothing else to ration, and we all knew it. Tyrell started pacing the room, stopping every so often to glare at Mr. Whalen, whose answers to his demands were growing shorter. Lucas stayed in his corner, his hands tucked under his arms, his head down like he was trying to make himself invisible. Naomi stayed at her desk, flipping through her textbook, even though I was certain she wasn't reading it. Jordan sat near the front, his arms crossed over his chest, his legs bouncing in restless frustration. Around midday, Tyrell grabbed an empty candy wrapper from the trash can near Mr. Whalen's desk, held it up, and demanded to know why no one had thought ahead. Mr. Whalen didn't respond at first, but when Tyrell slammed the wrapper on the desk and repeated the question, his voice sharp and loud, Mr. Whalen stepped forward and told him to sit down. Tyrell laughed, a short, bitter sound, and then kicked the trash can across the room. It hit a desk leg and clattered to the floor. Mr. Whalen didn't flinch, but raised his voice and told Tyrell that if he didn't stop, there would be consequences. Tyrell didn't push further, but his muttering didn't stop. That evening, Lucas dropped his water cup, spilling it across the floor near the bathroom corner. Tyrell saw it happen and immediately rounded on him, accusing him of wasting resources. Lucas stammered out an apology, but Tyrell wasn't satisfied and grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him up from his chair. Lucas's feet barely touched the ground as Tyrell shook him and demanded to know why he wasn't being more careful. Jordan stepped in, his hand landing on Tyrell's shoulder as he told him to put Lucas down. Tyrell hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening in Lucas's shirt, and then shoved the boy backward into his chair. Lucas hit the desk with his hip, but didn't say anything, just hunched further into himself. Tyrell walked away, still muttering. By the 6th day, the arguments were constant. Tyrell accused Naomi of hiding food in her bag, and when she told him to get lost, he grabbed her bag off the desk and dumped it onto the floor. Notebooks and pencils scattered across the tiles, but there was nothing else inside. Naomi got to her feet and shoved him hard enough to make him take a step back, but before Tyrell could respond, Jordan was there again, telling him to leave her alone. Mr. Whalen told everyone to sit down and stop wasting energy, but his voice didn't carry the same authority it had before. Cassie sat in the corner by the window, her knees pulled up to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. No one went near her, not after she'd started screaming the night before about bugs under her skin. She clawed at her arms until they were raw and bleeding, and Mr. Whalen had to pull her hands away to stop her. He told us she was just dehydrated and delirious, but he'd avoided looking anyone in the eye when he said it. That afternoon, Jordan tried to organize a game of cards, saying it would help distract everyone. A few of us joined in, but Tyrell stayed in his corner, watching like he didn't trust any of us. Naomi sat at the desk across from me, shuffling the cards with quick, precise movements, her eyes flicking toward Tyrell every so often. When Lucas hesitated to join, Jordan waved him over and told him to sit, saying he needed the practice. Lucas glanced at Tyrell before sliding into the seat next to me, his movements cautious. The game didn't last long. Tyrell interrupted by walking over to the bathroom corner, loudly announcing how disgusting it was, and kicking one of the buckets. It tipped over, spilling its contents onto the floor, and everyone froze. Jordan stood up so fast his chair tipped backward, and Tyrell just stared at him, smirking. Mr. Whalen shouted at Tyrell to clean it up, but Tyrell didn't move. Jordan stepped forward, his fists clenched, but Naomi grabbed his arm and told him not to waste his energy. Mr. Whalen grabbed a roll of paper towels and told Tyrell that if he didn't clean it up, he'd do it himself. Tyrell laughed again, loud and sharp, and told him to have at it before walking back to his corner. Mr. Whalen stayed at his desk, staring at the surveillance camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. His lips moved like he was talking to it, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. Naomi noticed too, and whispered to me that she thought he was losing it. Jordan sat near the front of the room, his back against the wall, his head resting on his knees. Tyrell stayed in his corner, sprawled in his chair with his arms crossed. Lucas sat next to me, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting someone to jump at him. I tried to sleep but couldn't. The faint sound of Mr. Whalen's voice, low and steady, kept drawing my attention. I didn't know what he was saying, but every time I looked over, his eyes were locked on the camera, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. By the seventh day, Lucas didn't come to the water fountain when it was his turn. He stayed in the back corner of the room, his head resting on the desk, and when Mr. Whalen called his name, he didn't look up. Jordan walked over, shook him by the shoulder, and then turned to Mr. Whalen, saying Lucas was awake but not moving. Mr. Whalen walked over with his hands on his hips, leaned down close, and told Lucas to get up and drink. But Lucas just mumbled something none of us could hear. Mr. Whalen walked back to his desk, rummaged through the drawers, pulled out a small bottle of vitamins, and told Jordan to get Lucas to take one. Jordan grabbed the bottle, but when he put a pill on the desk in front of Lucas, the kid just stared at it. Naomi came over, picked it up, and held it out, saying he needed to take it, but he didn't respond until she forced it into his hand and told him to swallow it right there in front of them. Lucas nodded and did as he was told, but he didn't move from his seat again. That afternoon, Tyrell started flipping desks. He didn't say anything, just walked up to the row near the back, lifted one corner of a desk, and tipped it onto its side. Mr. Whalen shouted at him to stop, but Tyrell ignored him, moving to the next desk and doing the same. Jordan got up, stepped between Tyrell and the next desk, and told him to quit. Tyrell stared at him for a long time before backing off, saying the room needed a change. Naomi sat down next to me, shuffled a deck of cards, and told me she was tired of waiting for something to happen. She spread the cards out in a neat row on the desk, flipped one over, then flipped it back, and asked what I thought was going to happen next. I didn't answer, and she told me she thought the lockdown wasn't about a virus. She leaned in close, kept her voice low, and said she was sure we were being tested for something, that it wasn't normal for Ivy to ignore Mr. Whalen's questions the way it had been. I asked what she thought it was, and she said it didn't matter, but that we'd better figure it out before someone else cracked. The fight started that evening. Tyrell and Danny were first, shoving each other over an argument about the water line. Danny said Tyrell had taken more than his share, and Tyrell grabbed Danny by the shirt and slammed him into the wall. Danny hit back, catching Tyrell in the side of the face, and Tyrell retaliated by swinging him around and throwing him into one of the tip desks. The noise brought Mr. Whalen out of his daze, and he rushed forward, pulling them apart and yelling at both of them to sit down. After that, things didn't settle. Tyrell kept throwing out accusations about hoarded resources, saying he wouldn't be surprised if Naomi was hiding food somewhere. Naomi told him to prove it and emptied her bag onto her desk again. Tyrell watched her do it and then looked over at Lucas, who still hadn't moved. He pointed at him and asked if anyone had checked his stuff, and Jordan told him to leave the kid alone. Tyrell just laughed and said it wasn't personal, but that nobody could be trusted when they were starving. Jordan told Tyrell that if he came near Lucas again, they'd have a problem, and Tyrell just grinned and said they already had won. Mr. Whalen stayed at the front of the room, pacing back and forth. He muttered something about prioritizing, about how survival required hard choices, and Naomi said loud enough for everyone to hear that it sounded like Mr. Whalen was planning something. Mr. Whalen stopped pacing, looked directly at her, and told her to keep her theories to herself. She didn't say anything after that, but she stayed close to Jordan for the rest of the night. On the 8th day, Jordan tried to convince Lucas to move closer to the group. He told him it wasn't safe for him to sit in the back corner alone, but Lucas didn't budge. Jordan sat with him for a while, saying he wasn't going to leave him there, and I heard him tell Lucas that he was going to get him through this. Lucas nodded but didn't say anything. Tyrell started talking about making plans, saying it wasn't going to work if everyone just kept waiting around for something to change. He said the strongest should decide what happens next, and that waiting for the weakest to catch up was a waste of time. Mr. Whalen didn't say anything to that, and Naomi leaned over and told me that Tyrell and Mr. Whalen were starting to sound the same. That evening, Mr. Whalen gathered everyone near the front of the room. Lucas stayed in his seat, but everyone else moved closer. Mr. Whalen said we needed to talk about the reality of the situation, that it was clear by now that no one was coming to let us out. He said we were on our own, and that it was time to think about what survival really meant. He looked around the room, his eyes pausing on Lucas, and said that hard choices had to be made, that survival was about prioritizing resources, and that sometimes sacrifices had to be made for the greater good. Jordan stood up, his hands clenched at his sides, and told Mr. Whalen that no one was going to die in that room. Mr. Whalen asked if he had a better plan, and Jordan said he didn't need one, that they just needed to stay together. Mr. Whalen said staying together wasn't enough when resources were limited, and Jordan told him to shut his mouth before he said something he couldn't take back. Mr. Whalen stepped back, but didn't stop talking. He said it was biology, that when a group's resources were limited, the weakest members were the ones who suffered first, and that it was the group's responsibility to make sure the strongest survived. Jordan stepped forward, got in his face, and told him to say it outright if he was planning on killing someone. Mr. Whalen didn't answer right away, and Naomi told him he didn't need to because it was already obvious. The room fell silent after that, but the tension didn't go away. Mr. Whalen stayed near his desk, watching everyone closely, and Tyrell didn't stop smirking. By the 9th day, Mr. Whalen stayed near the front of the room, muttering to himself and carving something into the top of his desk with a pen cap. The rest of us sat in silence, except for Tyrell, who paced the length of the classroom, occasionally stopping to glare at Lucas or Naomi. Jordan stayed close to Lucas, keeping one hand on the back of the boy's chair like he thought Tyrell might lunge at him at any moment. Naomi sat across from me, dealing out cards to an invisible player, her movements quick, her face set in a grim expression. Tyrell broke the silence by slamming his hands on a desk and shouting that he was done sitting around. He pointed at Mr. Whalen and demanded to know what the plan was, saying it was clear the teacher wasn't doing anything useful. Mr. Whalen didn't look up from his desk, but told Tyrell to sit down and stop disrupting the group. Tyrell laughed and said there wasn't a group anymore, that it was every man for himself now. And then he kicked over a chair and said if Mr. Whalen didn't have a plan, then he'd come up with one himself. Jordan stood and told Tyrell to sit down before he made things worse. But Tyrell ignored him and walked over to Lucas, leaning down so his face was level with the boys. He said Lucas was dead weight and that they'd all be better off without him. Lucas didn't respond, just stared at the desk in front of him. But Jordan grabbed Tyrell by the back of his shirt and pulled him away, telling him to back off and keep his hands to himself. Tyrell shoved Jordan's hand off his shoulder and said it wasn't personal, just a fact, and Jordan stepped between him and Lucas, crossing his arms and daring Tyrell to come any closer. Naomi stood and told Tyrell to stop wasting everyone's time with his posturing, and Tyrell turned on her, saying she had no room to talk when she wasn't contributing anything useful. Naomi stepped forward and said if Tyrell wanted to be useful, he should shut his mouth and sit down. Tyrell smirked and said it was funny hearing that from someone who was just as weak as Lucas, and Naomi stepped closer like she was ready to throw a punch, but Mr. Whalen shouted at all of them to sit down and shut up. Everyone froze as Mr. Whalen stood, holding the pen cap in one hand and slamming the other onto his desk. He told Tyrell to sit down before he got himself into more trouble than he could handle, and Tyrell stared at him for a long moment before backing off and sitting in the back row, his arms crossed and his eyes still locked on Lucas. Jordan told Lucas to stay where he was and then went back to his seat, but he didn't stop watching Tyrell. That evening, Mr. Whalen gathered everyone near the front of the room again. Lucas stayed in his seat, but the rest of us moved closer. Mr. Whalen said we needed to stop pretending things were going to get better, that it was clear by now that no one was coming to let us out. He said we needed to take control of the situation and start thinking about what survival really meant. He looked at each of us as he spoke, his eyes lingering on Lucas, and said survival wasn't about hoping for the best, but about making the hard choices no one wanted to make. Jordan stood and told Mr. Whalen to stop talking before he said something he couldn't take back, and Mr. Whalen told him to sit down and listen, that they didn't have time to waste on moral debates. Jordan didn't sit, just crossed his arms and stared at Mr. Whalen as he kept talking, saying that when resources were limited, the group needed to prioritize the strongest members and let go of the weakest. He said it wasn't about cruelty, but about biology, and that ignoring it would only lead to all of them dying. Naomi said loud enough for everyone to hear that it sounded like Mr. Whalen was planning on killing someone, and Mr. Whalen told her to stop twisting his words. She didn't back down, saying his words didn't need twisting when they were already clear, and Mr. Whalen told her she wasn't helping the group by sowing dissent. Jordan told Mr. Whalen to stop deflecting and say outright if he was planning on hurting someone, and Mr. Whalen said he wasn't planning anything, but that he wasn't going to let the group suffer because of one person's inability to contribute. Tyrell laughed from the back of the room and said he didn't think Mr. Whalen was wrong, and Jordan told him to stay out of it. Tyrell shrugged and said he was just saying what everyone else was thinking, and Naomi told him to shut up before he made things worse. Mr. Whalen told all of us to calm down and think about the reality of the situation, but Jordan stepped forward and said the reality was that no one in the room was going to die while he was there. Mr. Whalen stared at Jordan for a long moment before saying it wasn't up to him to decide what the group needed, and Jordan told him to say it again to his face. Mr. Whalen didn't answer, just stepped back and said the group needed to have an honest conversation about survival. Jordan told him the conversation was over and that if he tried anything, he'd regret it. The two of them stared each other down until Naomi told Jordan to sit down and save his energy. No one slept. Tyrell stayed in the back row, his feet propped up on the desk in front of him, while Jordan stayed near Lucas, his arms crossed and his eyes locked on Tyrell. Naomi stayed close to me, shuffling her deck of cards and glancing at Mr. Whalen, who sat at his desk, carving into the wood again. I didn't ask what he was carving, but I could see the lines he was making were long, like he was sketching something. On the 10th day, Mr. Whalen didn't sit at his desk when the morning started. He stood near the door, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room as if counting something. And when Naomi asked him what he was doing, he told her to stay seated. Jordan moved closer to Lucas, sat down in the chair next to him, and rested his hands on the desk like he was ready to push himself up at any second. Tyrell stayed in the back row, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, staring at Mr. Whalen with a smirk like he was waiting for something to happen. By midday, Mr. Whalen walked to the center of the room, cleared his throat, and said he had something to say. Jordan stood up, told him no one wanted to hear it, and Mr. Whalen told him to sit down. Jordan didn't move, just crossed his arms and told Mr. Whalen to go ahead and say whatever he thought was worth hearing. Mr. Whalen said we were all out of time, that it was clear no one was coming, and that the group needed to make decisions that would allow the majority to survive. Jordan said the only decision being made was that no one in the room was going to die. Mr. Whalen said decisions didn't care about opinions, that decisions were facts, and the fact was that they couldn't sustain everyone. Naomi told him to stop talking before he said something that would make him a target, and Mr. Whalen told her she didn't understand what it meant to carry responsibility. Tyrell laughed and said Mr. Whalen was the only one making sense in the room, and Jordan told him to keep his mouth shut if he didn't want it shut for him. The tension broke when Mr. Whalen stepped toward Lucas and said his name. Lucas didn't look up, didn't move, didn't say anything, and Mr. Whalen said it again louder. Jordan stepped in front of Lucas and told Mr. Whalen not to take another step, and Mr. Whalen said he wasn't going to let the group die because Jordan couldn't make the hard decisions. Jordan grabbed the front of Mr. Whalen's shirt and told him the only decision he needed to make was how quickly he was going to back off. Mr. Whalen shoved Jordan's hands off him and said the group didn't need heroes, it needed survivors. Tyrell stood up, clapped his hands, and said if Jordan and Mr. Whalen wanted to fight, they should get on with it. Naomi told Tyrell to sit down before she made him sit down, and Tyrell said she was welcome to try. Jordan told Tyrell to shut up and stay out of it, and Tyrell said it wasn't like Jordan was making things better. Mr. Whalen walked back to his desk, picked up the pen cap, and said it didn't matter what anyone thought because survival didn't care about opinions. Naomi told him opinions were all he had, and he told her opinions weren't enough to save anyone. Naomi sat across from me, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed on Mr. Whalen, who hadn't moved from his desk. Tyrell leaned back in his chair, his feet propped up on the desk in front of him, his eyes moving between Jordan and Lucas like he was waiting for something to happen. Jordan stayed next to Lucas, his hands resting on the desk, his shoulders tense like he was ready to jump up at any moment. Mr. Whalen sat at his desk, his hands moving slowly over the surface, the pen cap dragging long lines into the wood. Around midnight, the room exploded into chaos. Tyrell shouted, his voice echoing off the walls, and I turned to see him lunging at Danny, his hands grabbing the smaller boy by the shirt and shoving him into the tipped desks. Danny swung back, his fist catching Tyrell in the side of the face, but Tyrell didn't let go, just slammed him into the desks again and shouted something I couldn't make out. Jordan jumped up, ran across the room, grabbed Tyrell by the shoulders, and yanked him backward, sending him stumbling into the back row. Mr. Whalen stood up, shouted at everyone to sit down, and walked toward the commotion, but no one listened. Tyrell shoved Jordan, told him to mind his own business, and Jordan shoved him back, told him to sit down before he got hurt. Danny scrambled to his feet, pushed past both of them, and ran to the front of the room, his hand pressed against his side like he'd been hit hard. Naomi moved to stand between Jordan and Tyrell, told them both to stop wasting energy, and Tyrell told her to move out of the way. Jordan said Tyrell needed to sit down and shut up, and Tyrell said he wasn't taking orders from anyone. Mr. Whalen stepped in, raised his voice, told everyone to stop, and said the group needed to focus on survival instead of petty fights. Tyrell turned on Mr. Whalen, said if he wanted to talk about survival, then he should start making the decisions he kept talking about. Mr. Whalen stared at him, didn't say anything for a long moment, then walked back to his desk and sat down. Tyrell smirked, turned to Jordan, and said he wasn't the problem, but Jordan told him to sit down anyway. The rest of the night passed in silence. Tyrell stayed in the back row, his arms crossed, his eyes watching everyone like he was waiting for the next excuse to start something. Mr. Whalen sat at his desk, his hands moving over the wood in careful strokes. Naomi sat next to me, her arms crossed, her fingers tapping against her elbow in a steady rhythm. Jordan stayed next to Lucas, his hands resting on the desk, his eyes locked on Tyrell.